today we're getting to for what is like the most fundamental period for Western art, and that is classical Greece. And what happens to make Greece such an important part of the Western tradition. So towards the end of the Bronze Age, we have this massive conflict, perhaps the Trojan War, perhaps something else, where we have a complete collapse of Mycenaean civilization, and resulted in the Greek Dark Ages. This, of course, causes the mass chaos known as the Bronze Age collapse. We're several hundred years now, and we're not going to have much in the way of civilization in ancient Greece. So many civilizations were destroyed, and the Greek civilization was one of the most devastated, and nothing would happen in like 3 or 4 centuries, other than a few small villages and goat herders. That's it. And that's why we call this time the Greek Dark Ages. So when things started in the region again, they're in the Aegean Sea, Aegean in Greece. They're going to start slow. So let's talk about pre-classical Greece. And the Greek Dark Ages don't have any set dates, so some around the year 1200 BC is when the Bronze Age collapse happens, and up until about year 800. There isn't really much going on, so it's about a 400, 500 year period where we don't see a lot of things. So I see no major art, no major buildings, nothing of any significant scale, no city-states or independent kingdoms or large settlements. It's not until the 9th century and well into the 8th century and well into the 9th century, the independent city-states and polis start to form. Some of the areas more tribal, and they form actual kingdoms with kings, but some, create completely different forms of society. And Athens goes on to become a nation, and democracy, and Sparta becomes a kind of fascist state. And the art being produced at this time is very, very simple. We call it proto-geometric, because the first identifiable style that we can recognize in this pre-classical Greece, this post-Bronze Age Greece, is the geometric style. And so we're going to just call it proto-geometric. You can see it's very simplified, stylized decorations in terms of buildings, and we have only very simple buildings. Very basic stone foundations, and then we have just a frame structure over top.
Mm-hmm.
So from this very simple roots, we can break into some distinct periods, which are recognizable because of stylistic differences. First and foremost is the geometric period. And we see wooden structures, and we're going to see geometric pottery, and we have a period called the Orientalizing period, which is where influence come from the Orient, from the East, of course. It always confuses people where you say Orient almost being like the Far East. It's in China, Japan, Korea, but Orient here just means like anything east of Greece. So this is the Near East. Their places coming from Eastern Mediterranean influence from cultures like the Phoenicians, cultures like the Persians and Babylonians, those people who are in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then we're going to go into the Archaic period. The Archaic period, where first monumental sculpture starts to appear and ends with the Persian Wars, precisely somewhere between AD time, the Battle of the Marathon in 490 BCE. We'll talk about that later. So it doesn't mean that things aren't happening here in Iron Age. Iron Age 3, you can kind of overlay styles on top of that. And after about 490, we're into the early classical period. So some things are being developed even at an early date. So let's take a look at the geometric period stuff. So when bronze come back, and even though iron becomes a choice for making weapons and tools, bronze is still around. It's still very valuable material. It's very easy to cast. So to see being cast into small figures like the one on the left, most of these are very small indeed. It's not about larger than 6 inches, and we call them geometric bronzes because they're solid, they have very simple forms, and you can see how the horses and people are being in the sculptures. They're often broken down to geometric blocks. The same thing is true for pottery. And you can see why we call this one geometric period because all the features and all the decorations geometrical. And we have what's known as Greek key. And this motif here is called a Greek key motif. Like this one. The pattern is going to show up forever. Yeah, so the figures themselves are very geometric. And this is a funerary vase. Yeah. This is funerary vase. So it's a very common feature in Greek culture. When somebody died and you would put a vase on their grave, and this vase would be a place where you could pour libations, and it's kind of a liquid. You pour in honor of someone who's deceased, or perhaps a god or something of their nature. So you could pour oil into this. You could pour wine. There's lots of things you could pour into it, and you come back and fill it up. So like Memorial Day today, we take flowers to graves, and they'll actually have vases. And sometimes fill these vases with offerings of oil and wine. And sometimes these vases have false bottoms, so like only the top part is full. And so it looks like a full vase, but it's not really full. In this one, however, it was probably made for somebody very important, and it's actually full vase. And you'll notice again of this very strong geometric decoration has a Greek key across top here. And you can see it has these figures that they're made mostly out of triangles and very simple forms on the lower level. So we see warriors and chariots and horses. They're probably funerary games. It was a very common practice in ancient Greek world to have funerary games. And you actually read about this in the Iliad after Troilus got killed, and he put on Achilles' armor. And he pretends to be Achilles because Achilles won't go out and fight, and he does this to try to inspire people. He ends up getting killed, and Achilles honors him by having games, chariot races, and contests of various types. So that's probably what this is meant to be depicting. Right here on the center panel, right here, you see the enlargement. And it's the funerary. It's the funeral self, and you can see a canopy has been put over the top of the deceased person. His body is just made of triangles. His head is almost simplified down to only an eye. It's really kind of interesting. He lays on a funeral bed over animals, and probably sacrificial animals are below. And we have figures that probably represent his family and his loved ones. And here you realize that people have a box-like arms, and they're actually reaching up to tear out their hair. And that's what they're doing. This is a universal expression of grief in the ancient Greek world. And you will see everywhere this tearing of clothes or tearing of hair. You're tearing your hair out as a sign of grief. And you'll notice that he's flanked. He's surrounded by a large number of mourners who are all tearing their hair out, like holding their arms over. And this is probably hired mourners. We know it's a practice in the ancient Greek world to hire mourners. Actually, do these wild and outrageous displays of grief at your funeral. Nobody wants to have a funeral, nobody shows up and grieves. So you have professional mourners, and that's evidence. This is probably very early practice in ancient Greece. Well, from the geometric period, we'll go from the Orientalizing period. So again, we see an influx of themes. Now again, this is going to be the Eastern Mediterranean, a little bit of Egypt, mostly from places like Assyria, Persia, and Babylon. So these are the sources we're going to see. Like this griffin. Griffins are a theme we've seen all over the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see composite supernatural creatures, frontal figures, and some cult statues. One of the biggest things we see are cauldrons again. Cauldrons are things where you offer libations. You pour in liquids as an offering to the deceased, to your ancestors, or to the gods, and to these cauldrons are going to have very elaborate decorations. So here's one of the cauldrons, and this one has an elaborate stand. On the stand, you can notice there's a drawing of the winged sphinx creatures. You can see it's very like the stuff from the Levantine coast and other locations, and then has those handles to being held up. So this is very stylized. You can see the influence also Greeks are coming to their own style. So all of this rich material culture coming from the Asian Near East, and they're mimicking it. They're making it in their own style, adding to their own spin, but it's definitely coming from that region. You can see the same thing in pottery. So the pottery likewise is going to have these sphinx-like creatures. And here you're going to have this very kind of sharp edges when we look at chasing dogs and rabbits. And it's very much like we see on Assyrian stuff, which would have been when we see them coming with themes or scenes that are more uniquely Greek. And this wonderful vase has a number of things we recognize from Greek mythology. First off, the belly of this vase, we have female creatures. You can see they're wearing dresses and have one leg out, but the faces of those monstrous faces, they're snakes coming out of their hair, and they're gorgons. They're the monsters like Medusa from the story of Perseus. And we have a boar and a lion facing off on the shoulders. On the neck, we have this scene of a detail. And one of the most famous scenes in Greek mythology comes from the Odyssey. So of course about Odysseus. He's one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and he spends 10 years of the Trojan War, only to spend the next 10 years trying to get home from one misadventure to the other. In those misadventures, he's trapped in the caves by the Cyclops, Polyphemus, or Polyphemus. And they actually get past the Cyclops of waiting for him to sleep, and he and his men gather together, and they take a hot wood to burn his eye out and just makes them blind so they can't see when they sneak out and try to stop them. But they cling to the bellies of the huge sheep that Cyclops kept so that they can get out. When you look at this, you can see these eyes are hollow, kind of forward. Their profiles are very simple, and their body is rendered very simply. So, there's no kind of consistency, and these faces are kind of white. And sometimes the bodies are painted in black, but Odysseus here is painted light-colored. So there's a variety of techniques going on, and what's interesting is we notice none of the art have anyways, it's just art for art's sake. and it was just for aesthetic purposes. And no matter which way you look at it, all is gone about. Sense of space is gone, and those registers of narrative stories. It is much more what we see, like mythical, aesthetic things during the Bronze Age. So also we do start to see a return to large-scale statues. These are the first monumental statues and objects that we see since the Bronze Age. They were very simple, and they're going to be frontal effaced. These are what we usually call cult statues, or statues that are used for religious worship. So the statue just illustrates a story, it's just a work of art. But a statue you're expected to make of that embodies the presence of the god. Remember how I talk about presence and likeness. So here's a case of presence again. It's a cult statue, it functions in religious worship. And this clearly was some kind of early cult statue. Look at the statue, it's very, very thin. And when you look at her from the side, it's very flat. That's been stood up, carved on all sides, but it's not quite sculpture, in the wrong sculpture. And yeah, so it's very thin. They get a little better. When later they're trying to flesh out the human figure. One of the things emerges the thing we called the Daedalic style. So the style represents more realistic anatomy, like this goddess, and also Greeks like sport, and they loved athletics, and athletics were forms. So how would we shall say they were performed in everyday lives, and often statues pictured kind of sport and picturing vibrant ideal persons on an athletic person also. So as we move on, we start talking about architecture. One of the earliest sites where we start to see architecture as a place is called thermals, sometimes called thermonic, and this is one of the first true Greek temples. Here you can see the temple we're talking about right here, and it was built right over the top of some of those kind of hair-owned ancestor shrines. But this thing's quite a bit larger than those ancestor shrines and a lot more sophisticated. It has a pretty straightforward, simple floor plan. It has an outer foundation that supported columns and a porch that went all the way around. And then it had an interior section. It had a row of columns that went all the way down the center. And they probably haven't figured out how to support a very large interior. So when you look at this plane, you see a very great amount of pillars. All the sides. So it's one of the earliest Greek temples, but it's a really good one to study because it shows you how Greek temples evolved. And you can see all the later Greek temples are echoed in its plan. And the building was also made predominantly out of wood and brick. That's the stone foundation, but most of it's wood and brick, with a little terracotta for tiles and the cornicles at the roof, and also for decoration. So while this was made in wooden architecture, it eventually becomes the inspiration of all Greek stone structures that exist in later Greek art. So it's a good one to learn all the parts of Greek temple. The first big issue for Greek temple is the center section, which is called the cella cell, as in Latin. So now it's Greek, and this is the place where the god resides. This is where the cult statue of the deity being worshipped will reside. And then there's a very distinctive porch. which is called in Greek the pronaos. And the thing, the front of the nails. It's literally a lot like invented word, and you would just take all the words and you smash them together so we have a very clear porch. And for whatever reason, the Greeks, they developed a great love of axial symmetry. So when this thing's being symmetrical side to side and so we have this on the front, we have added on the back, and actually exists for no logical reason other than to be parallel to the porch on the opposite side. We suppose this was a place for the votives, in a place where God resides, and it's very sacred and only functionaries and for priests would be allowed in there. So if you only were an ordinary person, you want to give something that was close to the sanctuary God, but you weren't allowed into the sanctuary where God is. And this is where you would give your devotion. We often see that a lot of these things have shields or spear points or helmets if you survived the battle. And you know your helmet spared you from spirit to the head. So you would inscribe your name on the name of the God that you credit for your miraculous survival. And you stick that in the porch on the opposite side. So that was what the historians think it was for. Literally means just a peristyle. And so this building's very symmetrical. On the front of the building, we have what's called a facade. It's actually a French word. We don't know what Greek call it. But this was described in terms of how many columns there are across a facade. So this has 5 columns. So this is pentastyle. And if it has 6 columns, it would be hexastyle. If it has 7, it would be heptastyle. So and so on and so forth. And so now above this is a triangular section. And what we call a pediment. So houses in the desert, they mostly have flat roofs, and you cannot get away with that in the Near East because it's very not very west. But Greece is pretty wet, and you have to have a tilted roof so that to shed the water, and so that gives you gable on the end in the triangular zone. So this is often a zone for decoration, sculpture. And now the transition from the columns of facade to the pediment. And this roof has a very complicated architectural piece, which we call entablature. So actually the entablatures, everything from the column to the roof, and has 2 parts. It's the lower part known as an architrave, and the upper part known as a frieze. And the frieze has 2 parts. It has a triglyph and it's a metapene, and then on to all of this is a thing we call a cornice. And all of this is supported by a column capital below, and the triglyph from the metabe are very interesting. And here, anyways, if you imagine those buildings are made out of wooden beams, and you have a wooden beam that was, crossing their beams, and you imagine there's one beam going this way, and you can see the wood here. You have another beam on top of it. So going this direction, and was supposed to end grain here, and end grain would be susceptible to rot. So you wouldn't want that to rot, and you would need to cover it up. So you cover it up with this triglyph over here, just a clay tile to protect the end of the beam so that's not rotted. Well, no, you only have a beam every like so many feet, and there's one next one over there somewhere, and you have an empty space in between. So you don't want animals or squirrels or any other demons getting into your building. So what you do is you'll fill it up with bricks. But bricks are ugly. So you need something else to cover that. And what to decide is to cover it with a tile. And the tile is often decorated. And the tile's called a metape. So that's what metape is. So triglyphs and metapes were actually very, very practical pieces of architecture that were designed to protect architecture, but it quickly became kind of formal decoration zones for decoration. We can actually look at the metapes. Some of the metapes from temples survived. So here's one of these, and it shows three women. It's actually three women seated, and they have offering plates. And notice how vibrant their clothes are. Greeks really love vibrant clothing, and we almost imagine like I'm wearing white sheets, but that's they draw people in beautiful clothing. And these three women might actually have been gods or goddesses characters in the story. We don't actually know. But here's on the left, just one person can actually recognize. Like he has little wings on his boots. He also has head of a monster held under his arms, so that's actually Perseus, and after he's cut off the head of Medusa, he's returning, coming back, flying with his winged feet, and helmet breaks the frame, and his foot also breaks out of the frame, so it gives him this energy. His pulse is very stiff. He's got one arm up, one arm down, one leg out, and one leg down, so that's meant to indicate running. That's kind of gestured convention towards running, but that's showed him is very old. Now, in the style where you have a metape tree cliff on one end and tablature sitting in columns, so eventually creates this thing called Doric order. And Doric order combines all of these elements originally created for wood buildings into stone buildings. And all the pieces and parts are there. This is the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. It's a male. Anyways, Greek start building this massive stone architectures.好像少一张 PPT。
OK，
我关了。
关。
Anyways, so they're often are summarized into three main orders of the Greek buildings, but it's actually not true. The truth is there kind of dozens of orders, and it's not clear cut where one order ends and one order begins. It's not much clear categories. It's a broad spectrum. Go into any art history class and they'll tell you there are three orders: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Anyway, it's just a matter of opinion. So let's concentrate into Doric. And it was first founded in Doria, where it's on the opposite side of the Aegean Sea. So anyway, sometimes the best place to look for Greek architecture isn't actually in Greece, but some of the most most well-preserved Greek architecture is going to be outside Greece, at one of its colonies. So where do we get this to see the origins of actually going to be Egypt? And it's Egypt where we first started to see things now that look like this. And these are the columns from the Temple of Zoser. And sure, these are personified or imagined as bundles of papyrus flowers. Now these go out. They are scalloped in the opposite direction instead of going in, but that's clearly what's being gestured here. And it's also the temple, so sure, when we see first kind of column capitals and their kind of shapes, they're meant to represent budding flowers like lotuses or papyrus plants. Greeks were seeing these and they're inspired by these. And they just made their own, continue to stylize them. Which brings us fully into the Archaic period. So the Archaic period is the first period of truly monumental art and architecture since the Bronze Age and Bronze Age collapsed. We don't see any large temples of the Orientalizing period, but in the Archaic period we see very large temples and massive temples, and these temples are showed you and pasted onto first one from the Archaic period. The next one was transitioning from the Archaic into the Classical. And we also see some interesting conventions of the human form. So very rigid human composition, very tightly patterned here, clothing. So one of the most strange things is the archaic smile. The faces are going to look very like masks, and they all have happy face. It's kind of a silly grin. So you can see here the hair is tightly patterned. And it's a complete mystery, so no one's entirely certain why they decided to depict the faces like this. And all of the faces are depicted this way, so one of the theories is that they wanted to show these things like lifelike. And so, of course, only living people's smiles of the smile, they indicate to have a capacity for life. They weren't really concerned about realism of these figures, of the lifelike quality. So it's just a stylization that kind of stuck. And if you have these very mask-like faces, but we have lots of sculpture from the Archaic period. We have our contextual sculptures. We'll take a look at those. Anyways. So this one thing that begins to set Greeks apart are freestanding sculptures, and there are actually two types of sculptures really stand out. There are male and female sculptures. They're called individually akouros. It's the plural written here, and they are female figures. Notice the female figures are always dressed. It's the point there are dedicatory statues, and they're usually dedicated to goddesses or to deities you usually see. So the women are fully dressed, and they're usually holding out one hand, holding a plate or a vessel, or an apple, some kind of offering to the gods. And they're religious statues. So, anyways, while the female statues are dressed, the male statues are often of athletes and warriors, and they're often depicted wearing no clothes, and this represents the heroic ideal man used to perform athletic events, and they did not go into battle wearing armor. So this is seen as a dedication to heroes, athletes, and warriors. So if a young man dies in battle, they will make a statue and dedicate it to him, or somebody achieves some great heroic act, either in athletics or sport or in war, and he would get a statue dedicated to him. So the female statues are more oriented towards cult practice in their religion, but the other statues are more dedicated to personal heroes and their idols. So it's far more personal. It's nothing like that in the Near Eastern world, either to kings or God, not much else. So this is development of these statues, and they're both relatively early examples. So we talked about Greeks, and we also talked about how they're kind of not a unified people, but they do have a lot of common culture, and one of the most important locations to all of ancient Greeks is a place called Delphi, and it's very little valley, but Delphi is important because Delphi is the site of the Delphic oracle. And Apollo has a temple here, and according to legend, underneath the sanctuary of this temple, and gases would rise, vapors from maybe a sulfuric spring, nobody really knows. Gases would come up from a priestess known as the Pythian priestess, would sit on the tripod, and she would take the sacred artifacts of the god Apollo in her hands, and Laura in one hand was just the sacred tree to Apollo, and here she shows her holding a fiala, kind of offering plate, and she would sit on this tripod. She would go into a trance, and she would make these utterings, and a priest would come and interpret the utterings, and he would issue prophecy so that the god Apollo is believed to speak through these priestesses at this location. So while the Greek city-states all hated each other and fought many wars with each other, this was considered a sacred place and everybody had access to it. So they would just come and hear this woman mutter and then have it interpreted by a priest into a prophecy. I'm not sure why this was a big deal, but if you believe in God, this is the god versions of Apollo. It's the god of visions. So that makes sense. You'll go there, but if you know anything about the prophecies were uttered by the Delphic oracle, they're kind of confusing, vague. And one time a king goes to the oracle and says, "We go to war today, and then a great nation shall fall." And he assumed that it was the enemy they were talking about, but they were actually talking about himself. So there was a kind of double-edged quality to these oracles. Nevertheless, it was a great important feature of the religious life, and Delphic oracles pop up throughout Greek mythology. Also, many historical figures come here. So, a massive sanctuary is built around this. Here is the temple of Apollo and where the oracle operate. And of course, because you have sanctuary, here you have to have a place where people can meet and enjoy entertainment. But the biggest thing is that there are also treasuries. So all of these little buildings you see are treasuries. And the treasury again was treasury for your town. So there are many city-states that will come here and they will make offerings to the god. But they also wanted to make sure that everybody knew what their offerings were, and they wanted them to be distinct. So on the road leading to the sanctuary, they will build little tiny temples. There were treasuries, and they will hold votive objects. And tripods were popular, but also spears, swords, golden statues, and many other things were given as a gift to Apollo. It's a way of saying thanks to the oracle. And so at this point, we're going to talk about this building right here. It's the Sifnium treasury. So the island Signals is, it's not on this map. Anyways, it's off mainland Greece. But people would come here to Delphi to get oracles, and that's how important it was. Even people living out in the middle of the Aegean Sea would still go there. And so there are many unique features we're going to talk about, and one of the unique features is the facade of this symphony and treasury. So really unique is the pendant sculpture. So about the carotids. It's one of the first examples of carotids, female figures, that acts as columns. So it's kind of interesting innovation. It's a pediment sculpture, and it's one of the first pediment sculptures that has a unified theme. Shows a continuous story and narrative, and then instead of triglyphs and metaphase, we actually have an entire narrative. And so here's the story of the battle between gods and the giants. So in early Greek mythology, you have a succession of gods. And the first gods that come along are Titans. And Titans are overthrown by Olympians, and Mother Earth, was the mother of Titans, isn't happy, so she sent giants and monsters to defeat the Olympians, and Olympians have to prove they're really deserving to be the gods of this world and be overthrowing these giants. So let's take a closer look at the pediment up here. So first and foremost, this pediment shows the story of mythology of this battle over the oracle between Apollo and Hercules. Sorry, I typoed. Anyways, Hercules. So if you're familiar with the stars, Hercules, he is a pretty buff guy. He has massive legs, and he wanted an oracle for himself, so he's trying to steal the tripod, which is an important function of the oracle. So remember the tripod. Here is the tripod right here. He's trying to steal it from Apollo, who's unfortunately his head's broken off here. They're playing tug of war with the thing to prevent him from doing that, and then behind Apollo is the twin sister, Artemis. And Artemis, floating onto him, and then in the middle is Athena, who is trying to arbitrate disputes so the gods are bigger than anyone else, and they fit on either side. But if we go back to the reconstruction, you can see that on the side we have chariots and other figures that fit in. They crouch down to fit the space, but it's a much more coherent story and a much more coherent use of this strange triangular space we see in the pediment. So when we take a look at it, you can see there's more dynamic action. Like more interactive narrative. You see a scene that looks like a coherent story coming together. And this is what makes this so powerful. We see that they're not just posing figures, and they're actually creating very compelling narrative. Mila?